Okay, let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. Today is Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. This is the meeting of the Assembly Legislative Committee. We are noticed from 1 to 2 p.m. today, and we will start with introductions.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley, and then on the phone we have George Martinez.
Yes, thank you.
And any other members on the phone? Okay, we'll keep an eye. And then we also have members of the administration. We have our state lobbyists, and I see a few other folks in the audience, as well as legislative services and assembly council. So we will hear from those folks shortly. So, and then I'll keep an eye on, we usually don't have members of the public here to provide comment, but I will make sure to check in by the end of the hour if we are getting close on time for those, if anybody shows up on the phone. So today what we're going to do is go through, of course, this committee has not met since the summer. So this is our first meeting of kind of looking ahead to the next legislative season in 2025. And we are embarking on one of the biggest jobs for this committee, or really the biggest job, which is preparing the legislative program. And so we are not doing that in a vacuum, of course. It is a collaborative effort with the mayor's office, and we have a deadline in code to pass this by early December. So we are keeping on that timeline. And then I will also say that we had a little bit of change up on the committee. So Assembly Chair Constant was serving as vice chair of this committee. Now it is Assembly Member Johnson. He apologizes for not being here today, but he will be serving with me in the leadership role on this committee. So in terms of our agenda, and I do want to make one addition to our agenda, and that is to add under new business a very brief presentation from our legislative consultants, our lobbyists. So if there's any objections to that, let me know. Not seeing any. Okay, so we will consider that a brief amendment to the agenda. First, I'll note that we have under unfinished business. Oh, and I'll say also, if you're on the phone, please text me if you want to be in the queue, or speak up if I'm not seeing you in time. Under unfinished business, we have, of course, our standing updates on federal, state legislation, district and member priorities. I will note that we're going to skip that for now unless there are any burning updates. I know the legislature's not in session currently. We did have a really great debrief back in June about what happened during the legislative session. And then I will note the one thing that happened after that was the governor's vetoes of the budget and some other legislation. We documented those in our newsletter. And so in the interest of time, we won't go through those again, but we do know that there were impacts there that happened at the end of June. So then moving on to new business, and then we will get into some more detail. First, let's have our presentation from legislative consultants. And then I want to keep that to just a few minutes if possible. Okay. And then after that, we'll get into kind of looking ahead for next year, and hopefully this will cue us up in terms of thinking about timelines and making sure that we're on track. So I will turn it over to Wendy Chamberlain. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Wendy Chamberlain. My partner here, Heather Breaks. We're here just to listen to the Assembly's presentation and listen to your input on what our direction is moving into the next legislative session. The only thing I did want to give you, Heather and I, was a calendar of the session. I think that it was provided to you all. And as you'll see, dates become very important. And the reason they do is we have a pre-file date, a date of release of bills, and another second release of bills, and then the start of session. Any more with this legislature and with the previous 4 or 5 legislators, unless you have your bill pre-filed or in the first couple of weeks of session, it's impossible to get in one session. So I bring that up because now they take time out with budget. They listen to presentations on oil and OPEC, and they do school funding for weeks. I think last year they spent some time on school and gender and things like that take up a lot of the weeks of the session. So our goal is always to get, if we want them this session, to get them in and get them legally drafted, because legal's now taking weeks to get a bill out for us, and then get them introduced so that they're ready the first week of session. Once they're in, we can go with them. So I give you that calendar because that gives you an idea. The second thing I wanted to bring up, and I'll turn this one over to Heather, because she, as you know, does all the work for Municipal League. I do Anchorage because Heather does Municipal League, although we both swap back and forth. I get most of my information from Heather and from Assembly Member Browley, so that's really helpful. Heather, one or two things in the vetoes we need to watch? In the vetoes, we need to watch community assistance was vetoed.
Yes, the recapitalization of the fund was partially vetoed. So that will need to be increased with general funds this year to ensure that the full $30 million distribution goes out on July 1 of 2025. And the other thing, of course, is that will be high on the list is education funding for this year. As you know, the legislature included and the governor approved a one-time outside the formula increase or appropriation for K-12, and so that will be addressed again in this coming session, whether that's through a statutory change or again a one-time funding. We'll have to see sort of where the legislature goes on that front.
All right, thank you. Any questions? Okay, I'll also note that we were joined by Assembly Chair Constant just a couple minutes ago. And yeah, and thank you for sharing the timeline. And then we'll get into kind of where we're at in the process. But just to say that I know we've talked previously about if we do have priority bills, that's something we could be working on now, find someone to help draft it. So I think parallel to kind of our discussion about priorities, we should think more specifically, especially if there's something that we still want to do that didn't pass the last year, or we have a very targeted change that is easy to turn into a bill. I think we can kind of work on those in parallel. Okay, so with that, I will move on. So the bulk of our discussion today is going to be really looking ahead and charting the path to get our legislative program done. And then I will also be turning it over shortly to Nolan Clauda from the mayor's office, who will speak to kind of his part or the executive side of the collaborative approach. But before we do that, I want to point us just very briefly to, we have a printouts, the Assembly Legislative Committee plan, just a 2-page document. And then I'll just note, this is an update of what we had last year. It's got the committee description there for your reference. We've set some goals for 2024. One of which is finishing the program, making sure that we adopt it on time per the code deadline. I'll just note that for whatever reason, it says that the program must be introduced before our budget is passed. So we're looking to introduce it at the November 19th meeting, whether it's a draft or whether we're ready to vote on it there. And then it must be passed by December 10th. So we are looking at possibly November 19th a vote or December 3rd, and then we'll have to just see where we are in the process. But I feel good that we will get there. And then lastly, we have the goal that the Assembly and Mayor jointly host an event for the Anchorage delegation in November or early December. Last year, the Mayor's office hosted a luncheon in Anchorage over at the Denina Center, and then the Assembly hosted a dinner down in Juneau in February during session. So we're still working out again kind of what that looks like, but the goal again is to collaborate. So then I'll note also we have our schedule. It's listed out by month, and it's got things that have already happened just for reference. We've got our upcoming committee meetings. It's also got some key points in the budget process because, of course, the capital improvement program also informs what goes in this program. So making sure that those parallel pieces are on track just for reference. And then, as I said, we'll have 2 more meetings scheduled for October 10th and November 7th, again, moving toward the goal of getting the program introduced in November and then either voted on November or December. So there's details there. And then, of course, we put in the timeline that our lobbyists also shared as far as pre-files, and then the dates of session just for reference. So that's kind of what we're looking at for the next several months. Any questions or additional comments on this document? Okay. Yeah, and then like I said, this is really just to kind of chart the path forward. And so then our goals for today, moving on to the next topic, is one, two, oh, and I'll note we were also joined just a second ago by Member Salt. Moving on, we want to start the discussion of what we want to put in our legislative program, what our priorities are. But before we do that, I think we also want to make sure that we are kind of resetting the relationship and the roles in this process, bringing the mayor's office back in. Of course, we did work closely with Mayor Bronson's legislative liaison last year. And then traditionally, some of this role in developing the program has really only sat with the mayor's office. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we're staying on track, but that we're co-leading this process, again, staying in our lanes. And then, of course, we'll be looking a lot to the mayor's office to set some direction as far as priorities like the port, what we're asking for, things like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Clauda to kind of talk generally about legislative approach. And then I'll just say if we can hold specific priorities, we'll get into that in the next item. But if you can speak kind of generally your role and then how we move forward from here.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Nolan Clauda, Mayor's Office Policy Director. Yes, so to introduce my sort of role to the committee, I am going to be kind of the hub and the point person for really kind of a shared responsibility that we have in the mayor's office of doing our government affairs work. So I can be a good point of contact for this committee, and it's kind of a there are going to be others involved in the administration who are going to help with government affairs. It's definitely something that has some shared responsibilities to it, but. What we are, it is one in particular, I'd mentioned Muni Manager Becky Wind Pearson, who's overseen a lot of government affairs work in her career. So I'm working closely with her on it as well. What we plan to do for our legislative priorities is to initiate a draft that we can submit to this committee of what we think are legislative priorities for consideration by this committee. We do like the idea of a unified legislative program that has the blessing of both administration and assembly. So that's very much in alignment with what we have in mind. We do have and working with the timeline that you've set out, Madam Chair, I think that works well with us. I think we can flesh out some specific details about when we can have our priorities to this committee, but that works very well from our side. We have some emerging priorities that from our preliminary discussions that I could quickly go through, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but as far as what can go into our legislative program, and some of these are also federal issues to some degree too. I think our federal and state programs are going to have a lot of alignment, maybe in different approaches to each, but the topic areas are going to be very similar. The port is definitely going to be one of the major priorities as it has been for the last few years. I think especially educating legislators about the importance of the port and how it goes beyond Anchorage, I think is that ongoing issue. So that's going to always be near the top of the list. Housing and homelessness more generally, unsurprisingly, and looking at the full kind of expanse of what that means, programs for sheltering as well as for other areas that address housing more generally are going to be important priorities for us. And then another one that we think deserves a lot of emphasis is energy, especially as relates to the energy situation in South Central Alaska with declining output of natural gas in Cook Inlet. And so we think that, some of the priorities are likely to include some of the large capital projects that are on the state's docket, potentially things like rail belt transmission upgrades, things like the new sources of energy production, like the Dixon diversion, that would have a large impact on Anchorage, but other places in South Central Alaska, as we have kind of the diminishing natural gas picture there. So a lot of work there. Also on the federal side, funding opportunities for some of those programs as well. We also know that we're going to track closely and with the help of legislative consultants on this, some of the issues that the Alaska Municipal League is tracking that are kind of more global to municipal governments in the state. And so a big example of that is property taxes with the state looking at, or with individual legislators looking at increasing mandatory exemptions like the senior exemption that would have very large impacts on our tax base. And so those are things we want to monitor very carefully and look at very closely. Lastly, part of the reason why our agenda is not completely fleshed out yet is that we've been gathering with the help of municipal manager when Pearson, we've been gathering priorities from departments as well. We found that a lot of departments have been doing kind of their own legislative affairs approaches to things, not necessarily in the most unified or connected way. And so what we're trying to do is gather those priorities, compile those, and then look at them in a strategic way. And so that's something that's also going to inform what our draft legislative priorities too. So those are my major updates, but I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Yeah, thank you. Questions from members?
Madam Chair, may I?
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Breaks.
One thing that you mentioned, and I wanted to highlight for this group especially, is the focus on energy. That is going to be another one of the highest priorities, both of the legislature and the administration this coming session. And as you mentioned, the mandatory tax exemptions, we saw that pass in House Bill 307 last year for energy, new projects coming online after July. And we fully expect that will be part of that ongoing discussion to incentivize more energy production and investment in Alaska. So that is something that we'll be watching very closely.
Thanks. Other comments or questions? And again, folks on the phone, you can text me, or if I miss it, feel free to speak up. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Branca.
So when you're looking at last year's legislative program, do you see that there would be lots of changes in it, or kind of a continuation of items that, similar focus? Do you have any rough idea of how in line you are with last year's program? I guess this isn't last year's.
Yes, through the chair, Member Branca. I think that there's a lot in the program that is still valid and relevant. A lot of it is tied to specific bills and language with specific actions because it was developed kind of in the middle of a session, I think, or between the or one legislative session, right? So I think there's some changes there and maybe some increased emphasis on energy. But I think there's some kind of just updating for the current environment to be done with it. But I think that the program last year, looked to be very well developed and fleshed out and made a lot of sense in the context it was created. So there's there's probably going to be a lot of areas of continuity.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Yeah, and I think that leads into our next discussion. So really the bulk of what we have today in the time we have left is we're imagining this being an iterative process starting from where we are. And as we said, I think I agree with Nolan that there will be a lot of continuity and things that we need to bring forward because these are things that we just know are the issues, right? And also we want to think about how to improve on this program. And I'm going to turn it briefly over to Ms. Ross in Legislative Services just to give some kind of maybe summarizing some of the feedback that we've gotten or ways that we think we can improve this in terms of the format. But before we do that, I'll just mention, so where I'd like to go today is definitely not getting into wordsmithing because we're not starting from the premise that we're just copying and pasting the program, but starting with kind of high level identifying both kind of big priorities that we want to keep in there. And then, and also thinking kind of about format, like how do we make sure that this document is the most usable that it can be, what it should include, what it shouldn't include, because we have some ideas that we want to run by you guys as far as format. And then beyond that, we'll kind of, my hope is that we actually just walk through page by page, again, not looking at all of the text, but kind of looking at the headers and saying, do we think this should stay in? Do we think it should come out, or do we think it's a question mark that we want to kind of look at and come back to? Because the goal is really to get feedback in this committee and then do some work before the next committee meeting to really start that draft, and then just identify where we need to get more information. So I'll use an example with education. We are not going to come up with the education strategy. We are going to work and really, I think, let the school district and the school board take the lead on that. But that's something that we know we need an answer to, whether it's keeping the exact same language that we had last year or changing it. So that's an example of where we're not going to solve that today, but we can make some kind of follow-up items and figure out who will follow up so that we're ready for the next meeting. So then I will turn briefly to Claire, just briefly to put you on the spot, just some of the suggestions that we've had so far in terms of format.
Thank you. Yes. And to let you know, Jennifer Beneklassen and I are switching roles. She's going to be taking lead on our legislative work, and I'll just be her backup. But since I was lead last year, I can give you a little bit of a rundown of our program and how we came about it. There's always a debate about whether we want this to be just really narrow focused or a menu of things that if a legislature wants to work on something, they can flip through it. And I think we narrowed it down quite a bit last year from the previous year, but I think we want to narrow it down even more. I feel like it felt wordy and heavy for a lot of us when we were trying to use it during the session. So I think our goal will be to have a lot less text and just kind of the big picture things, and then perhaps pass assembly resolutions that have more of the details of where you stand on the issues and what is needed. And that way that can free up more space to just have headers. And then when you go visit your legislator on a specific issue, you can reference the resolution for the details. We're also wanting, if you're supportive, to pull out the district priorities from this booklet and instead create a really nice 1 to 2 page handout that has the municipality's overall priorities and then one for each district that members can take when you're going down. So you just have a one sheet. It could be an insert in here that you'll just have a one sheet that you can reference when you're meeting with your legislators. Other things, we'd like to remove the administrative requests because we didn't really use this booklet with the governor and his staff. And if there are administrative requests this session, to put them into a letter that is sent to the governor, and then perhaps do some specific follow-up with the governor and his team on that and not use this book for that purpose. So that should save a lot of space, but otherwise keeping the general idea and color coding of it. And then I think finally, one other thing, there were things that got put in here that didn't have a champion for. And I just feel like if a member isn't going to go down to Juneau themselves or work with a coalition of providers that are also advocating, we just shouldn't put it in the booklet because a lot of us couldn't speak to them and it just felt like a waste. Like it's not really a priority if we put it in there and then no one's working on it. So I think we'll just be stressing as you put it together next year to just really think about what are the top priorities. And if we can only get 3 things out of the legislature, what is it? And then, throughout this session, the assembly can pass resolutions if there's new things that you want to talk about that come up as we go. I think the other comment we got is it looks too glossy and fancy, like we spent a lot of money on it, which we did not. We designed this in-house with Allie Hartman and we printed it at the municipal print shop. But we will be conscious of that, of making it look a little bit less high production. We just can't help how good we are. So, we did, I think after last session, we saw one other town from, I can't remember if it was Cordova, Valdez, had a 1-pager of their requests. Obviously, smaller communities don't have as much needs as Anchorage, but it was really neat to see theirs on a 1-pager, and it was really easy to read and understand. So we're kind of working towards not a 1-pager, but a smaller document.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ross. And I'll add too, I think we talked about this is a little in the weeds, but basically removing 4 pages so that it's 8 pages so that it's just less content and less room. So that's another thought. And again, with the idea that we don't need to use this to do every single advocacy task. So I have a few folks in the queue. I have Mr. Constant, Mr. Myers, and then Ms. Bronga. So go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Sure, thanks. I'm not sure how advisable it is to create a series of resolutions that back up the legislative program. Legislators already don't have much time to read the plan, and so the resolutions are great for direct intergovernmental communication on specific items, but I think just a 1-pager is better that reads in plain English than putting everything in multiple resolutions. I think the resolutions lose their effect if we use them too broadly.
Good point. We can definitely, and we have done that in the past of 1 to 2 pagers on specific topics. I don't think we did that as much last year because we're using the booklet, so we can go back to that.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Myers.
I'll just echo what Mr. Constant said. I agree with him. I think multiple resolutions, you tend to lose focus there. I guess my question would be to Wendy and Heather, what their recommendation would be for us, since they do this on a daily basis and represent obviously more than just a municipality, but what they see as most effective and what would help us become more effective.
Thank you very much, Scott, through the chair. I think when we go round, when we take the book, they do get confused. So what we try and do is with the Anchorage caucus say, these are Anchorage, the municipality of Anchorage, 1, 2, 3. These are what we have to have. With this book, it's really good, but I think it'd be better as backup for when each individual or certain legislators that need it. But we try and focus. We need this, we need this, and we need this. We need the port for this, we need homeless money for this, and we need, because like anything else, we find that at the end of the day, if you give them everything, you'll get the lowest thing on your priority list, and that'll be what you get. So we try and focus on our big three, realizing that we have to have one-on-one discussions with them on these things. Heather, you have anything?
Thanks. Ms. Bronco?
Could you give an example of what in here wasn't championed that, is it district priorities or what was in here that people didn't know what to speak to?
I'm thinking more specifically of the mental health ones, the $650,000 grant to the municipality of Anchorage for integrated medical and behavior. I think we focused a lot on the housing one, and I just don't remember if we talked about that much. Ms. Chamberlain can add to that. And then the changing the state labor laws, we did work on that, but there wasn't really a good pathway for it. So we didn't focus on it too much. And then the administrative requests, I don't really think we did much with those.
I'll just add and then let Ms. Chamberlain add too. Another one I'll point to is Ship Creek small boat launch. So we knew that was an issue. We've discussed it at the city level, but at least not in any conversation that I had were we pushing that as a capital request or whatever. So that's kind of it gets left off if there's not follow-up. And Ms. Chamberlain, if you want to add.
I think just one thing to bring up, Heather and I represent Alaska Behavioral Health Association. They're down quite a bit, and we're working on a fairly significant package for them for next session. We worked on one last session. We're coming in hard for them this session, and it does cover several of your priorities. So you could take that out of the book and we could go behind them, backing them up all the time, things like that.
Another thing I was thinking of with this district priorities, and this may not work, but maybe a citywide map that had dots, different colors for different districts, and then you could go follow up based on, I don't know what this one is, and so you just go to the dot and click it. But that wouldn't be in this pamphlet, but a map to introduce the idea and then go to this website.
Go ahead, Ms. Van Klassen.
Member Bronga, are you talking about a dot for each project or more kind of to show where the assembly districts overlay with the legislative districts? And it's a little bit messy overlay, but.
I was talking projects, and then you could kind of see the areas of town that may be getting a little left behind in requests. And so I thought that just might be my particular district, 3 of my 6 community councils on their CIP list always want something that's in Midtown district. It's really important to them. And so that might be kind of nice to see that for East Anchorage, the purple dot is over here in Midtown. They're showing some collaboration in projects. So
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Member Martinez?
Thank you, Chair. The question is to the legislative staff and consultants. To what extent do we align our legislative priority list with the actions that we know legislators are going to take? the way you just described, for example, another organization moving on a front that overlapped with something that we were concerned with last year, where we don't have to mention that this year, we just need to go reinforce their work. To what extent do we align with actions that we expect legislators are going to take, and is that an area of opportunity?
Thank you very much for the question through the chair. I think when you come to issues that legislators are going to go with, like let's take, we have one in here, they will reach out to you and we will certainly go to them. I think we have better, it's more effective if we focus heavily on that bill they're working on, like the blighted property bill or, behavioral health legislation, because we have a strong voice on that particular issue. So rather than have them all in our book, I would recommend you identify with legislators what their number 1, 2, and 3 priorities are, or what they're going to be pre-filing. And I think we met with several of them recently, and they have a suite of things they're going to introduce bills. Then get behind that bill heavily. Letters of support, resolutions, any backup information we can give them, because that travels through each committee with them on that particular issue, and it has more strength than in the funding or in the packet from the Muni.
Thank you. And just to follow up, perhaps
ahead.
the recommendation is to our staff, to the committee, to what extent do we do that now? I hadn't heard that type of conversation yet with respect to that research of alignment, knowing what legislators' interests are so that we can have better alignment. Seems like some of this discussion today was really about kind of back to the city, alignment with the various branches, and trying to figure out how to make the case compelling to state legislators. But it seems like that work of alignment early on is really important.
Well, I
Yeah,
think
go
one
ahead.
thing to add, and I don't know if it answers the question specifically, but I think that collaboration part is one of the reasons we want to have, it won't be for the program because the program will be well underway by then, but to have the luncheon or some type of event where the assembly members and the mayor's staff and the legislators can all get together and be able to have some of those conversations, we think will be useful in finding alignment.
Thank you. Just to close, I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate folks hearing that out. And I will flag just one particular type of issue that I have heard of. And if the bucket is housing, and I mentioned this at Rules recently, I heard that member Zach Fields or Representative Fields was advancing work in Juneau to get more housing dollars through ADA out into communities. And it seems like if a legislator is working on a bucket that is one of our priority buckets and they have an action that we can align with, it'll make it a little more streamlined and effective. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just briefly add to, just because it was relevant to this. I met with our staff, and I met with Representative Mears and Senator Kaufman, I think it was back in June. It's on the list. Just to ask, is there any opportunity to bring the Anchorage delegation together to have that conversation? And what they shared was just in practicality, they're in the middle of an election, and most of the members are. And so they didn't think that it was feasible to get the group together. And then we have, at least I have not been kind of talking to individual legislators too much about priorities, but I think that that is something that we can be doing parallel. And for the folks who aren't running for election right now, obviously they're in a different position. But yeah, Mr. Martinez, I think that is a good thing to flag, that we know some of the partners out there. We know another one is Housing Alaskans Public-Private Partnership. We want to support them because they align with our goals, but I think we haven't started those conversations yet. And my hope would be that we come to those meetings with a little bit more clarity around what our top level priorities are, and then figure out kind of what makes sense. So that's kind of the thought. Mr. Constant, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just think there's like a timing misalignment issue here. There is no new legislature until January. And so everybody, as you mentioned, is in campaign mode. There's 10 senators who will not have to campaign. So there's some work that can be done with them. But ultimately, the pre-filing process is December but our legislative program is due November. And so what we really would be wise to focus on in this round is our priorities. And then once the legislature convenes and we see where the wind is blowing, if you will, with members and their priorities, we can kind of take an opportunity in January to adjust our priorities. But then we can think about for next year's legislative program, which is the interim session legislative program between the first and second year, we can do more of that kind of alliance building, if you will. But in this go round, it's a really hard thing to do at the beginning of a legislature because none of the 40 are, except for maybe the 5 that don't have to run because they don't have opponents, charting out their kind of pre-filing, if you will, what their priorities are. So it's a good impulse. I just think that the timing is off in this go round to do it in a systematic way.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. So let's continue on, but before we kind of get into the into the content on the pages a little more, I also just wanted to come back to this idea of what to do with the district priorities. So I think and again, really defining what we're going to call the legislative program, the thing that we need to approve as a package, whether it's one document or multiple, and making sure that that is moving forward, recognizing that we can do other things like take action by resolution, we can produce one pagers on specific topics, et cetera, and we can react to other bills as they get introduced. But I wanted just feedback from members what you think would be useful. And again, I think, so we're starting from the premise that having individual district priorities, meaning our assembly districts, is important. A lot of that does tend to be capital projects. It doesn't have to be, but it's practically, it's physical things that get built in a place, or dealing with roads. But I wonder, should we try to make a booklet that has all of these district priorities, or do we want to do those kind of separate products? But really the question is, what would you find useful as a member, as you're talking to folks in your district, whether you're in Juneau or just meeting with them when they're back in Anchorage? What do you think would be useful in terms of what this looks like?
So I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I would like to see is a single unified program that incorporates all of it, but that's developed in a very useful way where items can be pulled out by members so that it's all in one place and it's all approved and adopted, but that it has multiple utilities as opposed to trying to create multiple various books.
Okay, so just to clarify, so saying kind of more what we have now, where the back 2 pages still has all of those individual district priorities.
And it might be even more of the district kind of beefed out a little bit, but basically a unified program that's set for approval in November. It should be a simple, clean document. I don't think a whole series of documents has more value.
Okay, any other thoughts on that? Go ahead, Mr. Myers.
I would just echo what Mr. Constant said and what Wendy had mentioned earlier. I think less is more when we're trying to ask for things from Juneau. So they're busy. They have a lot getting thrown at them all the time. So I think one concise document outlining what we want as a whole would probably be better.
Go ahead, Ms. Breaks.
I would agree with that, both sets of comments that for us, as Mr. Constant commented, that having multiple different sets of priorities would be difficult, and people would pull it out in an office and ask, anybody that's in representing the municipality. So I think for that purpose, it makes sense.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Yeah, one last time. We had this weird dynamic that happened last year where Dave Bonson made a document and shared it with the legislature purporting that it was the legislative program. what I'm hoping we're able to do, and I'm sure we'll be able to, is really unify the branches into a single document that has kind of a comprehensive set of mutually agreed upon priorities. So there's no gray area between us, no air gap, so that we don't get played in the same way that we did last year.
Go ahead, Nolan.
Yes, through the chair, Member Constant, that's absolutely the same lesson that we take away too, is that it does need to be a unified approach, and we're completely committed to that.
Okay, any other comments? Not seeing any. I think that makes sense. And again, I think we'll figure out kind of what level of detail that we need to put in the program, and that'll be something we'll keep working through. And then I will also note, in the meantime, obviously folks should go through all of this at your leisure, and if you have thoughts about this, to communicate with Ms. Veneklassen and Nolan, Mr. Clouda. And then also specifically just to flag, some of the things that are in our district priorities in this program aren't necessarily in the capital improvement program. And so therefore they weren't necessarily entered into CAPSIS, which is the legislative request system. So you can enter something manually. It doesn't have to be entered just through the CIP. But I just want to flag that as we move forward through the budget process, we focus a lot on the bond aspect of that, but also we need to think about what we're asking the state. And of course, that's something we'll be working with the administration closely on, but just making sure again that to Ms. Ross's point earlier, anything that's in here should have a champion and should be able to get in the queue to be considered. So we're trying to shore that up too. So just in the meantime, we're not going to talk about district priorities today, but please take another look at those and think about what you want to carry forward. And then making sure it's reflected in the budget side. Okay, any other comments on kind of big picture with the program? Oh, Ms. Branca, go ahead.
I'm almost hearing the boos as I say this, but you know me, I don't hold back. So the Port of Anchorage modernization, I know it's so important, but if I myself am going, oh, port again. I'm wondering in Juneau if it's sort of the same way. It's like, how, I guess we're going to have our hands out forever for that one. But if it's right here at the first thing, I wonder if some people just shut off. Okay, Anchorage wants the port again. So that's just my comment on it, that I feel like this might get a knee-jerk reaction of negativity that maybe we could put it later in the book and get to other things.
Breaks?
To that point, I think it's important to keep the port in as one of the top priorities. We're not only on offense, we're on defense. That appropriation was one of, if not the largest appropriation for many decades into a single project like that. So we don't know where oil prices are going to go. We don't know what kind of, what we're looking at in terms of deficit or surplus next year. And there are eyes on that appropriation. And so I think it's important to keep it there, as well as for supporters who were really instrumental in helping to get that appropriation, making sure that that is still in there for their purposes as well. So
Thank you. This is Wendy Chamberlain. I will tell you that last session, 3 times, the finance chair in the Senate walked by me and he was talking to different people. And of course, they're all asking for money. And he'd make a really loud comment just to be funny, but it wasn't funny to me. He'd say, why don't you go and talk to Anchorage over there? They've got plenty of money. They're sitting there with a couple of $100 million in port dollars. And we just look. So it reminds me that he never forgets that money's there. So I think I agree with Heather that while people go, oh, the port, I think we have to keep it up there like it's huge for us.
I really do appreciate the insight.
Yeah, thank you. And let's move into this. So what I'm hoping, because I know we have about 15 minutes left, hoping to really look through this program page by page, not spending time on all the words on the page, but just kind of an initial gut check, like, yes, keep this in. No, we don't think this is relevant, or a question mark, because we don't have to come up with all of this ourselves. And so I think to the point, The port, certainly, I think we do need to keep that in. But I think the comment is well taken. Like, how are we telling the story about that? And I think that's not something we're going to unpack today, really. But maybe Mr. Cloud, if you have initial comments on, if you have any insights on where you think where the administration wants to go with this, or just things that we, and it's fine to say we still have to work on it too. So go ahead.
So sorry, do you want me to comment on the port aspect of it or the?
Yeah, just example, like, so in 2024, we actually did not ask for any money. Our ask was saying, thank you for the investment that was already made. We are using it, and then really giving an update on where we're at. And so I think it's an open question right now. Are we asking for a dollar amount? What does that look like? So if you have thoughts on that, great. If not, then we will flag it for next time.
Sure. Yeah, Madam Chair, the conversations that we've had so far, and this is still, in the works, but the conversations we've had so far, thinking about advocacy for the port is just as Ms. Chamberlain and Ms. Briggs said, about defense, playing defense to some degree, and also being prepared for, the port is subject to bad sudden occurrences happening, and we have to be prepared to receive. I mean, we want to be able to receive help if something bad happens with failing infrastructure at the port suddenly, right? So that's one aspect of it. Beyond that, I don't know if we will have an ask, capital or otherwise. I couldn't tell you with complete certainty.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the update. And I think in general, what we're going to do is run through each of these. If we have some specifics or just really questions we want to chase down, then I think we can flag those. And then the goal is, as I said, before the next meeting, Mr. Johnson and I will work, and staff will work collaboratively with the mayor's office to kind of start producing a draft. So then moving on, we've got housing and homelessness. And again, I know there's a lot of words on the page, but if there's anything that jumps out to you, that we definitely should do, that we definitely should not do. I'll note that we were successful in getting that $4 million. So thank you again to the state, both branches, for supporting that. So that is an item that I have a question mark about, kind of what if any ask there is, but just to note that. But beyond that, just seeing if other folks have thoughts about housing and homelessness as a topic. Member Branca?
Well, looking at the port page and the housing and homelessness and behavioral health needs, I myself think a picture is worth 1,000 words. That maybe, if you added more pictures with just a little snippet underneath instead of all this wordage, a picture of what's going on at the port, and, with the housing and homelessness, a picture of the shelter that the legislature funded, just more picture, less words. And I don't know if that's just me, but.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I think if any thoughts, and I think that's important, right? How do we effectively communicate with legislators? That's the question. But we also want to look at the topic. So any other thoughts on how, go ahead, Ms. Briggs.
Sorry, just to jump in here on both items. The first on the port is if there is an ask for additional funds, the legislature is going to want to know, what have you spent already? And unless that is getting extremely low, the other piece of that they'll want to know is, and this was something that we agreed to when we got that appropriation, was making sure that we were going after every federal dollar opportunity. So what have you leveraged in federal dollars to match the state dollars? So that will be just extremely important to look at that ahead of time, to make those decisions. And secondly, just a word of caution on the 4 million. It was very, very rare to get operating dollars for that appropriation. And it is expected that we are not going back for another operating request. So just want to throw that out there for your internal discussions.
Member Bronga.
I love that. What have we, how have we leveraged funds? And maybe even in all of the categories, how much did the city put in on housing and homelessness? How much, so it's just really clear, chart of who is putting this money in on each of the different categories.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll note too, I know, at least from my experience in the past session, it was a scramble to pull together information, but it was clear that had we been more proactive in thinking about those things, so in addition to the program itself, but having that information and then having that story on the port, on housing, et cetera. So yeah, I think that's another takeaway is as, we can work on this and we should also think about kind of what information we can readily share so we're not scrambling. Go ahead, Mr. Claudia.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. On homelessness, I think we within the administration, we have some work to do to kind of define what might be possible and align with our priorities. But we know that we need a lot of resources there, and so whatever we have to think really strategically about what's possible with the state. On housing more broadly, there are a couple of areas that from the last session that I think are going to be interesting to watch, and one of them is the blighted properties bill, and then also there was a bill that would allow ADA to make loans for multifamily development, which would have been a really good source of capital that I think it passed in the Senate and died in a House committee. So some of those kinds of measures, if some of those members are still interested in pushing those forward, I think might be areas that we could talk about for housing.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll add to the list. I've been having a lot of conversations about housing and what could happen at the state, what could happen locally. I think too that I want to put broadly on the table is infrastructure and financing. I think those are the two biggest areas where the state, well, not only do we have limited capacity, but also where the state really could. And I think that aligns with the things that we've already said. So, so that's where I would see that going. And then let's keep moving. And again, if you have specific ideas, this is not the only venue to share those. So we want to get things in the hopper, but I want to work through this program. Going to the next page, page 5, mental and behavioral health. I think we talked about, and I think it sounds like there's alignment from the folks here to step back from that being one of our top priorities, but just briefly, if there's anything in here that we do want to pull out, or that we think would rise to the level of the program, just to flag those two. And Mr. Cloud, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Nothing at this point.
I'm thinking one of the problems that we had with the one to change the state labor laws to allow behavioral health staff to work 12-hour shifts is even though we supported it, it didn't come from us. And so when legislators were interested in that and they're like, well, how would that work? We're like, well, we don't know. So maybe once you see what the behavioral health organization comes up with, there could still be a line in here. We support their issues and then name them so then people know where to go to if they have questions.
Ms. Chamberlain?
Yes, we're working closely with the Behavioral Health Association, and we're getting a bill drafted right now that deals with, well, we're working on the administrative on the regs, and we're also dealing with the 1115 waiver. You're going to see a bill on those regulations that brings them right down and keeps them simple. And then as far as the labor laws too, we're looking at that. So 3 of those 4 behavioral health associations spending a lot of time on.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think that's a category where we can kind of check in with partners and then figure out what makes sense. So then moving to the next page, and I'll note the next couple pages really have, they have a short list of priorities up here, and then they've got the energy priority. I think we did talk about energy already, so I'm going to suggest we table that one. But just looking just at the top of page 6, we've got our bullet points here. And so just seeing if there's ones, well, and knowing that a lot of these are really, these are issues that we're carrying forward, but just seeing if there's ones in here that you think we should keep, remove, change. And I'll just note, I think we should remove the small boat launch, not because it isn't important, but we should decide if we're asking the state for money or not. And if we're not, then take it out. So that would be my suggestion. But seeing if others have thoughts or suggestions on this. Go ahead, Mr. Littlefield.
I tend to agree with you on the small boat launch. It's necessary. We need to have it. However, it needs to pay for itself. So I'm just thinking that it's not our obligation for however many, and I think they said 700 to 750 people use this, that they can't pay and we can't have a card system, whatever. I mean, where I launch on the Susitna Landing, I pay $600 a year just for the benefit of a launch, and somebody else is paying for it. So I think that it needs to be reverted back to the user group. That's where I would say, and I would remove it from the state request.
Okay, other thoughts on items that we have flagged here? Because I think, as I said, our working assumption is that probably most of these do get carried forward in some fashion. You know, we know education is an issue. We know defined benefit or the retirement system is an issue. So just seeing if there's any specifics as far as, or things that are missing that you want us to be thinking about. And Mr. Cloud, I don't know if you have thoughts on this either, not because you're coming with the answer to all of these, but just as you guys have been talking.
Yeah, I think one thing that's worth strategizing a little bit about is what we want to say about base student allocation increase in education funding. And I think that something very important to the state and to our city, but strategically, where do we position that, I think, is an open discussion.
Okay, any other thoughts on these priorities? Not seeing any. And I know I don't see any, well, I see folks in the back, but I don't see maybe folks who want to provide public comment. So, okay, I'm seeing no. We just have just a couple more minutes. The other thing I'll note on education, the Assembly and the school board have our quarterly joint meeting on Friday, the 27th of September. So I believe, I don't think we'll come out of that meeting with a specific answer to that question, but I think that's another venue that we will bring that up and really ask the school district and the school board what their timeline is for figuring that out. Okay, and then I'm just looking through the pages. They really are the additional topics plus the district priorities. So I guess just as we're closing out, just in general, is there anything that you would like to put on the table as something for consideration as a legislative priority, a topic area, or something that maybe we're thinking about that maybe has changed since last year? And I don't know if there is one, but just putting it out there. Okay, I'm not seeing any right now, but I know this is a very robust program, so we've got plenty to work from. So just to wrap up then, and again, text me if you have any additional comments you want to make. Our next steps are going to be, again, working with the mayor's office and our staff to really get a working draft of the content of the new program. So what you'll see in the next meeting is obviously not a final version, but really something more robust to respond to. And we'll try to get you out something before the meeting to review. And then again, if you have ideas, you have priorities, or really you want to talk about your district priorities, then I would encourage, looping in our staff so that they can track these conversations, but also to make time with the mayor's office, to meet with Mr. Clauda, to really talk through kind of what those look like. And then, of course, as we move through the budget process, please keep in mind what we want to put on the bonds and also what we want to ask at the state level. And I think that's it. So with that, we will have our next meeting on Thursday, October 10th. And thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll be adjourned. Thanks.